thank you all for having me here, all the organizers and people involved in this and having me here. And for the people who've met with me, I've been having a terrific time. My only regret is that nobody told me about the film festival. I would have stayed for another couple of days. So sometimes people ask me to be nice what I'm up to, and I tell them the truth, which is I'm writing a book. And then, still to be nice, they say, what's it about? And I say, empathy. And when I say that, I notice people smile a little bit. And then I add, I'm against it. And then it gets nervous laughter or kind of an angry frown. And I've come to realize that being against empathy is like being against kittens. It's not a sort of respectable view, and nobody believes it's a serious view. And so what I want to try to convince you in the time we have here is to take this view seriously. I hope to persuade some of you to be against empathy with me. Now, in order to do this, I think part of the reaction to my claim of being against empathy, is based on the fact that empathy means different things to different people. And so what I need to start off with, I need to start my talk in the worst of all possible ways by defining my terms. And so some people, when they talk about empathy, they mean everything good. Concern, compassion, kindness, love, morality, and so on. I'm not against that. I'm not against being good. And so if that's what you mean by empathy, I'm not against it in that sense. Other people mean empathy in a much more narrow sense. So this is sometimes called theory of mind, or naive psychology, or sometimes social intelligence. But sometimes it's called cognitive empathy, which is the ability to know what other people are thinking and feeling. And I'm not against that either. To be a good person, you have to understand the mental lives of other people so you know the impact that your behavior will have on them. On the other hand, and we could get to this later, I think that this is morally neutral. So it's a form of intelligence, and like any form of intelligence, it could be used for good or for evil. So somebody who is a really good person could have a lot of that, but also someone who's a really bad person could have a lot of that. In any case, what I mean by empathy is what used to be known as sympathy by the scholars of the 17th and 18th century. And I draw here upon the work of, and this is the way many psychologists use the term, but they get it from Adam Smith. And Adam Smith describes the following situation as exemplifying empathy. When we see a person, we place ourselves in his situation and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations, and even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them. So we put ourselves in other people's shoes. And Smith gives an example. When we see a stroke aimed and just ready to fall upon a leg or arm of another person, we naturally shrink and draw back our own leg or arm. And when it does fall, we feel it in some measure and are hurt by it as well as the sufferer. And here's my favorite illustration of an empathic response. Now, there's been a huge amount of interest in the psychological and neural mechanisms of empathy. We know now from a couple of decades of work that when you feel empathy with somebody, someone who's in pain, for instance, you yourself feel pain, perhaps to a lesser degree. And in fact, the same neural systems that would be active if you yourself was being poked or shocked become active if you watch somebody being poked or shocked and feel empathy for them. Sometimes empathy is related to the more general capacity we have to mirror other people's behavior in both thought and action. This is, I forget where I got this actually, but it's from a soccer player, and he misses this big kick. And so he puts his hands on the side of his head in anguish. That's not very interesting. But what's interesting is how the people around him respond. And like Christy, I'm a developmental psychologist, and young children show empathic responses, including empathic distress at the suffering of other people. Now, a lot of psychologists view empathy as critically important for our moral life. So Dan Batson, who's like the #1 empathy scholar in the world, has presented a lot of evidence for what he calls the empathy altruism hypothesis, which is that when you feel empathy for somebody, you put yourself in their shoes, you're then more likely to be altruistic towards them, to help them. Marty Hoffman has argued that although adult morality is complicated and heterogeneous, we start off with empathy. Empathy is the core of morality from which everything is built from. Frans de Waal takes this and extends it to other species. arguing that we don't live in an age of reason, but an age of empathy. And this holds not only for humans, but for non-human primates who show empathy for others. And that this is the foundation for morality more generally. Simon Baron-Cohen has what the most radical claim, perhaps, that for him, evil is nothing more than an empathy deficit. A lack of empathy is the cause of all evil in the world for Baron-Cohen. And if we could ratchet up our empathy, we would be better people to one another. It's not just psychologists and neuroscientists. A lot of popular figures and politicians talk about the virtues of empathy. So Obama, for instance, has said, when you choose to broaden your ambit of concern and empathize with the plight of others, whether they are close friends or distant strangers, it becomes harder not to act, harder not to help. And he says in another context, the biggest deficit we have in our society, in the world right now, is an empathy deficit. If you go on Amazon, you will find thousands of books with empathy in the title and the subtitle. This is from the top 20, and we'll see books for parents, books for children on empathy, self-help books, spiritual books, the occasional scientific book, and a couple of books on how to make money through the power of empathy, like well-designed, how to use empathy to sell your products. The term empathy was coined in 1909 by Titchener, and according to Google Ngrams, have been going steadily up in frequency in the written word, and steadily up in Google searches more recently. So, what's not to like? Well, before we get into the issues of empathy, one thing that even the biggest empathy fan should agree with is that there's other forces motivating good moral reasoning and good moral action besides empathy. So take a classic philosophical example. You're walking by the woods and you see a drowning child, drowning in the water, struggling in the water. Now, everybody knows the right thing to do is reach in and pull the child out. Now, is empathy involved? Well, it could be. You could feel what it's like to be drowning. Imagine, experience vicariously drowning. Or you could imagine what it'd be like for the parents of the child to hear their child has drowned. Feel that sorrow and pain through an imaginative empathic extension. You could do all that, but that's ridiculous. Your kid's drowning. You reach in and pull the kid out. You don't need to go through all this empathic hoo-ha. You just, you respond based on your drowning kid is bad. Shouldn't let kids drown. More generally, the philosopher Jesse Prince points out that empathy has certain, before you even get to the details, has certain limitations. So our morality, for instance, we recognize that there are harmless wrongs. That many people have moral systems involving, say, sexual morality, that could say something could be wrong even if it has no victim, and hence there's nobody hurt from it. Or there's wrongs with diffuse effects. So most people here would think that it's wrong to fake one's data, or cheat on one's taxes, throw garbage out of the window of a moving car. Even though you can't point to any specific person and say, oh, there's a victim, I have to feel empathic for them, because there's no specific victim, there are diffuse harms, but still we recognize that they're wrong. We also recognize that there are cases where empathy pushes us another way, and morality, a more attuned moral sense, pushes us in a different way. And my favorite example here is from Dan Batson, who's a really astute empathy scholar, and very pro-empathy, but also very, very cognizant of empathy's limitations. So he does a study in which he tells people about Sherry Summers, an imaginary young girl. And Sherry Summers has a degenerative disease, and she's going to die relatively soon. And there's a treatment that won't save her life, but it will alleviate her pain. And he discusses this in great detail, describing her situation, describing her family, and says, but she's on a line up. There's a list for who could get this treatment. Treatment's in short supply. It's a fair list. It's based on all sorts of fair considerations, and she is low on the list. She is never going to get the treatment. And then she said, so Batson asked the subject, should we move her up the list? And if you move her up the list, that means someone else who's on the list is going to go down and not get the treatment. And most people say, no. It's sad, but if it's a fair list, then no. Then he has another group, and he tells them exactly the same thing. But he adds just 2 sentences of the form, try to feel what she's feeling. Put yourself in her shoes. Now the results flip. And most people say, yeah, I'd move her up the list. And the way Batson puts it, and I agree, is that empathy is clouding you to a more objective moral judgment. And upon reflection, the first answer is the right one. You shouldn't move her up the list just because you feel what she feels. Empathy is distorting your judgment. Now, here, as more generally, we could see empathy as a spotlight. What empathy does is it zooms you in on you typically an individual, and motivates your concern and your kindness. And fans of empathy view its powers as that. In fact, it's often been argued that empathy can take someone who's indifferent and catalyze their moral response. This is not a new insight. All sorts of people have pointed this out, so in different ways. So Joseph Stalin, for instance, apocryphally said, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." Well, Mother Teresa said, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will." And there's a large body of psychological research looking at it. So say the work of Deborah Small and George Lowenstein. In one study, they gave people a description of a crisis and gave them great detail and asked how much money asked them to donate to charity. And in this study, they gave a little bit more than $1 on average. But another group had no statistics, but were given a picture and a name. And there, the donation shot up. Subsequent work by other scholars find that you'll give more to save one person than to save 5 people, so long as that one person has a face and a name. Now, so empathy there serves as a spotlight. And what I want to suggest is, here's where we can see the worries about empathy. Spotlights have narrow focus. And spotlights only focus on what you point them to, and sometimes you point them in the wrong places. As a result, empathy is biased, enumerate, concrete, and myopic. Now, one way to bring this out is, I want to look at some real-world cases that have inspired moral concern in the United States over these last many years. So one example is, and there's many cases like this, a case of baby Jessica, who was a little girl stuck in a well. When she was stuck in a well, all of America was transfixed by her plight. More recently, in 2005, Natalie Holloway, a young teenager, was lost in Aruba, presumably kidnapped. And there was a huge commotion about this. And more recently still, there was a mass shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, not far from where I live, in Sandy Hook Elementary School, which became the #1 news story for a very long time. Now, these are all significant and real events, and they should focus our concern. But people like Paul Slovic have pointed out the disproportionate nature of this concern. So Slovic points out that when the world was transfixed by Holloway, there was a famine in Darfur, of which tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people were dying. Yet Holloway got 13 times more coverage on network news than the Darfur famine. Mass shootings are a terrible thing. But if you look at the numbers and you calculate the proportion of homicides in the United States that are mass shootings, it's 0.1%. And what that means is if you could snap your fingers and make it so there will never be another mass shooting in the United States again, no one will ever notice, looking at the numbers, that you did that. This is like statistical rounding error. And so the point isn't that these cases don't matter. It's that they don't matter to the proportion that we give them to. They don't matter as much as we tend to think that they do. Then there's also the issue of bias. This was a cartoon done by an artist at the midst of the Ebola crisis, meant to comment on the fact that journalists focus obsessively on the very few white victims of the disease, while ignoring the far more black victims of the disease. And you don't need telling that there are definitely strong racial biases in our interests and concerns, not only in who we're interested in, but who we are retributive towards. This is from Jennifer Eberhardt's work. Eberhardt points out that holding everything else constant, you are far more likely to be executed if convicted of murder if you look like the person on the right than the person on the left. It's not just being seen as African American, it's the actual extent of one's skin color. Again, this is hardly a secret. The Onion recently satirized this by talking about an imaginary trial where they say, judge rules white girl will be tried as black adult. And the courtroom artist was instructed to depict her not as this, but as that. Now, I'm not saying that empathy is to blame for all of this. I think there's general patterns of bias and focus on identifiable victims that transcend any single emotion. My point, rather, is that empathy is uniquely vulnerable to this, because empathy zooms you in on an individual. This point was nicely made by the writer, writing quite some time ago, Annie Dillard, who writes, there are 1.2 billion people alive now in China. To get a feeling for what this means, simply take yourself in all your singularity, importance, complexity, and love, and multiply by 1.2 billion. See? Nothing to it. And certainly the neural findings of empathy, where they look for neural signatures of empathy, find that they're exquisitely sensitive to facts like in-group, out-group, race, nationality, and so on. In one study, for instance, they tested Europeans, and people would witness as another person received an electric shock. If that other person was described as being a fan of the same soccer team as the subject, parts of the brain associated with empathy would light up. They would feel that person's pain. If the person was described as a fan of an opposing soccer team, there would be no empathic response. More than that, parts of the brain associated with pleasure would light up as they watched that person being shocked. Now, one response to this is, fine, empathy isn't perfect. It's biased, it zooms you in on individuals and so on. But still, it's better than nothing. It makes the world a better place. Maybe not perfectly so. But it's easy to see that this is mistaken. So start with a hypothetical example. Imagine there's a vaccine program in place that saves the lives of dozens of children a year. Then imagine one child dies from the vaccine as a product of the vaccine. The vaccine program, I would argue, would certainly be shut down. Even though, because you could feel what it would be like to be the child or the parents of the child killed, well, it's hard. You can't feel for the lives of people who would have died but didn't because they got the vaccine. Take a real world case. In 1987, Willie Horton was released from the Massachusetts prison on a furlough program, and he went on to commit assault and rape. As a result, Michael Dukakis, who was the governor at the time running for president, it was considered a humiliating failure for Dukakis and contributed to him losing the presidential election. Now, it turns out that analyses of the furlough program revealed that taking everything into account, including cases like Willie Horton, the furlough program was leading to less crime. But it didn't feel that way to people. And because you could imagine what it would be like to be somebody, you could empathize with somebody assaulted and raped and have a huge emotional response. But you can't have a similar response to people who would have been hypothetically assaulted and raped but weren't. It gives rise to no feeling. And so there's an asymmetry between negative results, which have this huge effect on us, versus causing positive changes, which is a statistical abstraction that leaves us unmoved. Or take a bigger case, take third world aid. So there's a huge debate over whether the billions of dollars that countries like the United States send to developing countries actually make the world better, as opposed to having no effect or having or even having a deleterious effect. And you could see all sorts of ways in which our empathy could drive us to help and lead to counterproductive reactions. I'll give one example from Linda Polman. So Linda Polman interviewed warlords in Africa who would chop off the arms of children. And she asked them, why do you do this? And the response she got from more than one person surprised her. They said, we do this for you. When there's atrocities, it drives an American and European response, and NGOs come to that area. When NGOs come, they pay taxes to the warlords who are there, and so warlords profit from the attention of these people. And so they do it to exploit the empathy of wealthy people and then profit from their response. Or take another case, there are many child beggars in Africa and India. When you encounter one of these people, it seems like the best thing in the world to do is to give the starving child some money or some food. But under most analyses, when you do so, you support a criminal organization which ends up enslaving and often maiming many, many children. And so there are better ways to help children in Africa and India, but the immediate empathic response in these circumstances is not only counterproductive, but it's exploited by people who themselves are doing terrible things to children. Now, the answer to this is not, so you should do nothing because of unintended consequences and bad side effects and so on. Rather, I think a better answer is from the motto of the effective altruist, who talk about that when you decide what to do, you should use both your heart and your head. And I want to return to this. You might wonder, in conversations about empathy and public policy, people often say, well, as a liberal, I feel I should be more empathic. And in fact, some people have questioned whether in my anti-empathy movement, there's something sort of politically suspect about this, in that empathy is associated, as George Lakoff has argued, with progressive causes. And in fact, there's some truth to this. There's some truth. If you give people a standard empathy test, and then you ask them their political affiliations, it turns out that self-described liberals are somewhat more empathic. Not a huge effect, but a big enough effect to be reliable, are more empathic than self-described conservatives, with libertarians way at the bottom. But I want to suggest that this argument is mistaken in two ways. One thing is, people tend to believe their side has empathy favoring it. That if you really cared about people, put yourself in people's shoes, you would actually agree with me. But in fact, many sides show a symmetry, where it's not whether you empathize or not, it's rather who you choose to empathize with. If you're in favor of affirmative action in universities, you'll direct people's empathy towards a student who couldn't get in and didn't have the opportunity because of the color of his skin. If you are against such programs, you might empathize with a white kid who would have gotten in but didn't get in because of the program in place. If you are pro-choice, you'll empathize with the mother. If you are pro-life, you'll empathize with the fetus or the embryo. If you are in favor of gun laws, you'll try to direct people's empathy towards the victims of gun violence. If you are against gun laws, you will try to direct, as in this case, you will try to direct people's empathy towards the defenseless victims of crime, defenseless because the government took away their opportunity to protect themselves against violent criminals. Or to take a contemporary example, nobody should be allowed to give a talk without mentioning Trump at some point. And I want to put aside, I'm not going to politically color this, but there's certainly a tremendous extent of anti-immigrant rhetoric at this point. And if you believe that this is entirely motivated on hate and racism and terrible things, you're actually not listening very well. Because in all of Donald Trump's speeches arguing against, as he put it, illegal immigration, and in books like Ann Coulter's book, there's immense focus on what they see as the victims of immigration. So Trump talks endlessly and continuously about a woman who was murdered in California by an illegal immigrant, and what it must be like for her family and how terrible it is. People use empathy for all sorts of political aims, some which may not be your own. Finally, there are some paradigmatically liberal causes for which empathy plays very little role. In other words, if you hold these liberal causes, empathy is not your friend. So take the example of climate change. So Jeremy Rifkin argues that we need to expand our empathy so that we will care more about the planet Earth and its fate. But he's using empathy in a very broad sense. If you use empathy in a narrow sense, actually, it's very hard to get concerned about climate change, because all of the victims of climate change are statistical abstractions in the future. It's hard, you can't point to one person and say, that person is being harmed by climate change. Well, if you say increase gasoline taxes, you can point to one person and say these changes are affecting, are harming individuals. In fact, people who worry about climate change and try to focus people's empathy on the concern are stuck with something like this. But this is as good as it's going to get. Now, I'm talking so far about policy, but you can wonder about other aspects of life. So, for instance, you might think that doctors should be more empathic. And there's a large movement in the United States and Canada to have more empathy training in medical schools for doctors. And in fact, if you read the details, there's no reason to be against that. What they mean by empathy training is doctors should be trained to listen to their patients, to treat them with respect, to treat them like with kindness. What's not to like? But what about taking this literally, in the sense of feeling what other people feel? And here, I'm very moved by a wonderful discussion by Leslie Jamison, the essayist, who talked about her work being an SP, a simulated patient. And so as a simulated patient, students in medical school would treat her as a patient, try to diagnose her, ask her questions, and she would judge them on how well they did. And one of the things she would judge them was on their empathy score, on the empathy test. And she started off being really focused on how empathic people were when dealing with her. But then, as the story goes, she became ill herself for real. And she had to see a series of doctors for her illness. And she kind of thought about the doctors she interacted with. And she began to sour on empathy. And she writes, "Empathy is always perched precariously between gift and invasion." And she talks about this doctor she really liked and said, "I didn't need him to be my mother, even for a day. I only needed him to know what he was doing. His calmness didn't make me feel abandoned. It made me feel secure. I need to look at him and see the opposite of my fear, not its echo." And this is clearest when you think about therapy. So if I'm with my therapist and I'm all depressed, and I'm so depressed, my life is horrible, I want her to understand me, and I want her to care about me. I want her to say, have as a goal, make me better. But I don't want her to get depressed. I don't want to say, "Oh, it's horrible, your life's horrible." I don't want her to respond that way. I want her to have some distance. I want her to in some way, as Atul Gawande once put it, to treat me in part as a problem to be solved. Which sounds really cold, but it's what people do when they make other people better. Now, it turns out that, and in fact, one worry of being too empathic as a healthcare provider is burnout. And it turns out that the concern about burnout, about the stress of feeling other people's pain, is not a new concern. Buddhist theologians were worried about it a long time ago. So Buddhist theologians, for instance, argued about how one should be a good person. And they make a distinction between what they call sentimental compassion and great compassion. Sentimental compassion is what we've been calling empathy. It's feeling other people's pain. And they say, don't do that. You will not be able to sustain that for a long period of time. It'll be selfish, it is self-obsessed. Great compassion is have more of a distance. Loving kindness, they sometimes call it, where you feel this positive feeling towards others, but you don't suffer alongside with them. Now, this is all a theoretical distinction, but there's actually this wonderful work on this, and my favorite body of work comes from a terrific collaboration between the neuroscientist Tanya Singer and the Buddhist monk and biologist Matthew Ricard. And so they did a series of studies, including brain imaging studies, where they carefully tried to pull apart those two things. So they gave some of their subjects empathy training, where they were trained to feel the pain of other people, imagine what it's like to be them. And other subjects were given compassion or loving kindness training, where they were trained to direct their love and affection towards other people without any empathic resonance. And this is in a current biology article, they sum up their findings. Compassion training gives rise to positive feelings like love, good health approach and pro-social motivation. Empathic distress is self-related emotions give rise to stress, poor health, burnout, withdrawal, and non-social behavior. In a subsequent article, the social psychologist David DeSteno reviews several studies suggesting that mindfulness meditation actually can make people more altruistic for those suffering. And he argues that the mechanism through which this does so is that it shuts off your empathic response. It gives you some distance from which you can then do the right thing. Okay, well, what if we bring it even closer to day-to-day interactions? So do you really want to be with somebody who lacks empathy? Do you really want to have as your lover, your child, your friend, someone without empathy? After all, we tend to naturally think of people without empathy as psychopaths. And psychopaths are bad people. John Ronson, in his popular book, The Psychopath Test, views lack of empathy as the silver bullet, the magic bullet, views as really important for psychopathy. And I want to go back to this later, but I want to leave you with one thought when you decide to avoid people with low empathy. And it's from a big meta-analysis published a couple of years ago. And the title of the meta-analysis is The Non-Relation Between Empathy and Aggression, Surprising Results from the Meta-Analysis. And it's the non-relation is the surprising result. They looked at verbal aggression, physical aggression, sexual aggression. They looked at all sorts of populations, prison populations, college populations, men on the street, and so on. And it turns out that being low in empathy predicts just about nothing. If you want to know who's likely to insult you, to rape you, to beat you, knowing how empathic that person is on any one of 100 standard empathy scales will tell you nothing. I'll tell you in a little bit what will tell you. What is the answer? Okay, so this is briefly the case against empathy. Now I want to shift gears, and I want to say some nice things about empathy. Then I'm going to say some even worse things about empathy. So the first nice thing about empathy is that my complaint about empathy has to do with moral reason and moral action. I'm not denying for a second that empathy is a great source of pleasure. So one of the great pleasures in life is reading a good novel, or watching a movie, or a TV show, or a play. And often the pleasure resides in the empathic engagement of an imaginary others. Being for a moment James Bond or Hamlet or whatever. And you could extend this to all sorts of other examples. This is Adam Smith again with a wonderful example. When we've read a book or poem so often, we can no longer find any amusement in reading it by ourselves. We can still take pleasure in reading it to a companion. To him, it has all the graces of novelty. We enter into surprise and admiration, which naturally excites in him. Now, nobody reads books anymore. But what we do is we show each other YouTube videos. And we say, check out this video. And I watch you watch it. And I relive the enjoyment I had when I first watched The Farting Cats or whatever. So this is, by the way, one of the pleasures of having children. One of the pleasures of having children is it allows you to experience pleasures that you've had before 100 times for the first time all over again. Whether it's watching a Hitchcock movie or eating ice cream, you experience it again through the eyes of somebody you love. And that's empathic, and that's powerful. Michael Sloat gives another example. The philosopher Michael Sloat, a defender of empathy, gives another example. He talks about, imagine you had a daughter who collected stamps. So it's one thing for the father to respect it, to praise it, to appreciate it, but wouldn't it be something better, Sloat argues, if he shared in his daughter's enthusiasm, if he felt what she was feeling? And I think that's something many of us want from our intimate relationships. Then there's the moral force of empathy. So something as important as empathy can be used for all sorts of purposes, and I won't deny for a minute that it could be used for good purposes. Martha Nussbaum talks about Greek tragedies and writes the following. Although all of the future citizens who saw ancient tragedies were male, they were asked to have empathy with the suffering of many whose lot could never be theirs, such as Trojans and Persians and Africans, such as wives and daughters and mothers. And there's not that much psychological research on this, but there's good historical examples of where empathic engagement with imaginary others seems to catalyze our moral response to real people. This is Harriet Beecher Stowe. The story goes that that she was invited to the White House by Abraham Lincoln, and upon meeting her, Lincoln said, it was in the height of the Civil War, Lincoln said to her, "So you're the little lady who started this great big war." And he was talking about her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which nobody ever sees as a great work of literature or theology or law. But what it does is it allowed the readers to have empathic engagement with the plight of slaves, and to feel what it must be like, however limited a way. And this catalyzed, presumably, their moral action. And this happens more generally. So I think one of the major forces for moral change in my lifetime has been the situation comedy. So take The Cosby Show. And no, I'm not going to update my slides. The Cosby Show, whatever one may say, subsequent to that, played an important role in getting Americans, often white Americans who had no encounters with African Americans, to have a sympathetic and productive engagement with that group. Just as shows like Modern Family, and before that Will and Grace, did the same thing with gay and lesbian Americans. So I wouldn't doubt that empathy can be used as a tool to do good. But I also would suggest that empathy is a powerful tool that can be used for different purposes. So one of the interesting things is you could feel empathic engagement with all sorts of people, including people who aren't very good. Tony Soprano, The Sopranos, was definitely a bad guy, but many of the viewers of the series became engaged in his situation and rooted for him, wanted to support him. Or take Walter White of the wonderful TV series Breaking Bad. You don't have to watch the shows to appreciate the examples, but you should. So Walter White played this guy who started off as this high school teacher and became a seller of drugs and ultimately a murderer. And the viewers, often to the shock of the people who created the show, started to root for him, even though you weren't really supposed to. And this reached a certain point when the actress who played his wife wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times called "I Have a Character Issue." And she points out she played his wife, and his wife would do things like say, "Walter, stop killing so many people," and "Walter, murder is wrong." And she became hated. The character became hated, and then ultimately the actress became hated, getting death threats for her role. And this is the power of empathy in fiction goes both ways. One of my favorite books in the world is Lolita, which chronicles the story of Humbert Humbert and his pursuit of this nymphette, this young girl to have sex with. And it's beautifully written first person, and it is impossible to read this without, I would think, rooting for him, putting yourself in his shoes and adopting his goals. And this is in some way the problem with empathic engagement in fiction. For every Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's a Mein Kampf. For every Schindler's List, there's a Birth of a Nation. And it gets worse. So consider atrocities like the genocide in the Holocaust or lynchings of blacks in the American South. When social psychologists and political scientists talk about these atrocities, they talk about fear and hate and racism and xenophobia, and they're entirely right to do so. But such explanations are incomplete. They're incomplete because they miss the important role of empathy in triggering these atrocities. Not empathy for these people, but rather empathy for the imagined victims of these people. And again, this is an insight going back to Adam Smith. So Adam Smith talked about what happens when we see somebody victimized. When we see one man oppressed or injured by another, the sympathy which we feel for the distress of the sufferer seems to serve only to animate our fellow feeling with resentment against the offender. We are rejoiced to see him attack his adversary in his turn and are eager and ready to assist him. And so the lynchings of the blacks were prompted by stories about African Americans assaulting innocent white women. The attacks on the Jews in Germany in the 1930s and 40s were prompted by stories in which the Jews were predatory towards young innocent German children. And none of this is ancient history. Whenever a democratic country does a military action in another country, they'll often do so by appealing to the victims, the innocent victims, say, of Assad's poison gas. To the extent we go into a full-out war against ISIS, more and more of these pictures and videos will be distributed. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that military action is wrong, that's a separate question, but rather that just as in the case of Willie Horton or vaccines, empathy skews things the wrong way, because we can become intensely empathic towards the suffering victims in the here and now, while the victims of a military action on our side, on the other side, whatever, are statistical abstractions and leave us rather cold. So, to explore the claim that empathy is related to punitive reaction, and building on some other research that's been done recently on this, Nick Stagnaro and I did a very simple series of studies. So what we did was we gave people a simple empathy test, one from Simon Baron-Cohen, to get an empathy score on them. And then we told them an atrocity. So one of our experiments, the atrocity was some journalists were in Egypt, and they were set upon by Egyptian military forces. They were kidnapped and they were tortured. And then we asked, what should America do? And we gave them a list in terms of intensity. Do nothing, to public criticism, military action, or full-blown ground invasion. So we had 6 possibilities. It turned out that the higher your empathy score was, the more you were likely to endorse severe punishment. And we've since replicated that in 2 other scenarios, including a domestic child abuse scenario. Empathy can make us mean. I've argued here that empathy has these problems. It's biased, innumerate, concrete, and myopic. It directs our concern to the wrong places. But you can wonder, what replaces it? What else do we have? And I want to go back to this slogan about the heart and the head. I want to zoom first on the head. So Adam Smith is the #1 champion. He wrote the book on empathy. And then there's a part of the book where he asks, so when we're kind to strangers in faraway lands, when we are kind when it doesn't benefit us, what explains this? And his answer is, it's not empathy. It's not the soft power of humanity. It's not that feeble spark of benevolence which nature has lifted up in the human heart. Rather, it is reason, principle, conscience that calls to us with a voice capable of astonishing the most presumptuous of our passions, that we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. And this is sometimes called the principle of impartiality. And it shows up in various forms in every moral system, every religious moral system. Various forms of the Golden Rule, our Confucian sayings, as well as every moral philosophy. Whether it's a utilitarian saying we should add up pain and pleasure, not caring whose pain and pleasure it is, or the Kantian saying that we should follow universal principles of broad applicability, or someone like John Rawls saying we should make our decisions behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing who we are. These theories differ in all sorts of ways, but what they have in common is the idea that true moral action involves distancing oneself, not engaging, but distancing oneself. And my favorite summary of this isn't from a philosopher, it's from Humphrey Bogart at the end of Casablanca. Spoiler alert, he's telling his lover that they have to separate, even though it'll make the two of them and another guy, complicated story, and another guy very, very sad and mess up their lives and everything. And she says, but why? And he says, I won't give you my accent, but he says, it doesn't take much to see that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. So, at one point, then Smith says, what do you need to be a good person? And he says, it's not feeling, it's not depth of feeling. Depth of feeling will mess you up. You need two things to be a good person. Here are the two things you would bequeath to somebody that I would give to my child if I want my child to be good. And the first is smarts, superior reasoning and understanding. Why? Because to be a good person, you have to anticipate the consequences of your actions. You have to be able to figure out what's going to happen if you do this. And that requires smarts. Maybe that's all that smarts is in the end. And then second, he says self-command. It's an archaic term we now call self-control. Why do you need that? You need that because even if you know the right thing to do, you might be tempted to do something else. So you have to have the self-command to hold back on your bad impulses. With that in mind, let's go back to psychopathy. This is the Hare psychopath test. These are the items that are diagnostic of being a psychopath. You can quickly go through them and score yourself if you want to. It is true that one of the items is callousness, lack of empathy. But the studies have been done, and it turns out that your score on this sub-item has no predictive power on future criminal actions, which is where most of the studies are done. If you had somebody in prison and you had given a psychopath test, what would predict how likely they are to end up back in prison? How likely they are to reoffend and harm somebody? It's the items of factors 3 and 4 items. And none of this would have surprised Adam Smith, because factors 3 and 4 involve things like impulsivity, lack of realistic goals, irresponsibility, certainly a criminal past, poor control. If you want to know who's likely to rape, to kill, to insult, don't measure their empathy, measure their self-control. And finally, there's the heart. Now, David Hume famously, and I think accurately pointed out, that in order to be a good person, you need some sort of motivation. Unless you have some sort of emotional pull driving you to be a good person, I guess it would be a push, driving you to be a good person, you're not going to. You might know all the moral answers in the world, but that will do nothing for you. As he put it famously, reason is not only to be the slave of the passions. And I have no argument against that. But all I'll point out is, you don't need, the push does not have to be empathy. It could be a general diffuse compassion, a caring for others. I think what you need to be a good person is a compassion. You have to care for others, call it compassion, call it loving kindness. And then rather cold, hard rationality to figure out how to best affect the goals for yourself and for others. I hate terminological arguments. In the end, if you're going to insist that this is empathy, then I'm all in favor of empathy. I'm interested, whatever one wants to call it, in putting yourself in the shoes of other people and feeling what they feel. Regardless of what one calls that, I hope to have persuaded you that we might be better off without it. Thank you. Questions or thoughts? Yes.
Do you think? I mean, people like I think of like James Fallon, like the guy they talk about like they're like brain structures like connection between your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex. There's like a certain like just anatomical basis for empathic behaviors. Do you think people have like control? Like you can say like I choose to be empathetic or not, or is it something that people are just have a natural personality tendency towards that behavior pattern?
Good point. So good. I mean, good issue. Is empathy under control? The answer is twofold. One thing is, to some extent, it is. Plainly, we could choose to empathize with some people and not others through an active imagination. I could choose to right now undergo the exercise of feeling what it's like to be you, or I could choose not to focus on you at all. There might be some cases where it's involuntary. I'm in front of somebody and they hit their thumb with a hammer. I might flinch, and there might be nothing I could do about it. But for the most part, empathy is fed by the imagination, and it's fed by conscious will, and so we do have some control over it. From another perspective, things like meditative practices can modulate the amount of empathy one feels. So there is some control of it in real life. That's half the answer. The other half of the answer is, if you believe, as with me, that empathy is a bad thing, then getting around it need not require individual acts of control, but rather change at the level of policy. And as an example, suppose you think racial bias is a bad thing. One solution of that is to get people to be less racially biased. And you could do that to a varying extent. But another solution is you could change the decision architecture so that racial bias doesn't come into play. For instance, we could make decisions on personnel without knowing what race the individuals belong to. Yes?
Well, most of the examples you gave of empathy running into problems, what I might call online empathy, that is, at the time when you're about to act, you have empathy and it can mess up the action, but isn't there still a possible role of empathy in forming your beliefs and forming your moral structure or your belief structure, so that then that narrow focus can be repetitively focused here and there, different places, and interact with your reasoning to form your beliefs?
So, that's a really good question. Can you employ empathy constructively? Argument is twofold. One argument is empathy is a poor moral guide. If I decide what the right thing to do is, I shouldn't rely on my empathy, because my empathy will be biased. It will focus me on one versus many. It's true I could iterate and think about you and you and you and you, but I can't do that for 10,000 people. But the second issue is, can empathy be employed in order to motivate my actions or drive my actions? And people like Jamil Zaki have argued that it can be. And I think to some extent, you could use it as a way to provoke yourself. Suppose I decide that the best thing for me to do is help this man. I decide on based on pure morality, I should help this man. And then, but I don't really want to. So then I say, okay, I'm going to feel empathy towards him. And I think, oh, now I'll help him. And in some way, and so anything can be used as a tool, and empathy can be used as a tool that way. So can racial bias. Suppose I want to help this man, and I can't bring myself to it. Well, we're both white. Maybe that'll do the trick. And so, and I think of, and I use this on a par purposefully, because I want people to recognize that just because something can motivate you, and motivate you to do good at some point, doesn't mean we should in general favor it. Yeah?
How could one use empathy or techniques to bring out empathy in others for a good cause?
So, you're asking me to argue against my interests, because I'd rather people didn't do it so much. But it's actually pretty easy. I say, I want to argue against gun laws. And I say, let me tell you a story. Yeah, let me tell you a story. A young woman was in her house, guy pounding on the door. I'm going to kill you, he says. I'm going to kill. And I go on the story. But she had no gun. Why? Because Obama took it from her. Well, and then, and if I'm a good storyteller, and all politicians are good storyteller, you'll be crying a little bit. And you'll imagine what it's like to be her. And then I will get you on my cause. Similarly, a good storyteller could get you to favor gun laws, tell a different story. And so stories are a classic way to do it. I could even drag out people. In every state of the union, Republican or Democrat, they have people in there saying, oh, I have a new healthcare initiative and everything. It will help people who, they will help people who are jittery. Let me bring down this guy, some jittery guy. See? And so those are simple techniques. And if I were a politician, they have a million of them. And what I would do again is and I don't mean to be, I would like to have a world in which appealing to somebody's empathy would be viewed as on a par with appealing somebody's racial bias. I like people to say, once somebody says, oh, I'm in favor of this trade law, and let me tell you a story. I want people to say, Roy, what are you doing? Act like an adult, give me numbers. Yeah.
Would you say that the negative views on empathy would be in support of utopian societies such as 1984, Brave New World, or that doesn't seem radical?
Would you say, so it's an interesting issue. So do you mean that those societies, are you worried those societies are what you would get if you get rid of empathy?
If the negative thoughts and empathy were instilled in the government to such an extent that a utopian society be brought about. Not that it's very practical for that to happen, but would you say that your thoughts and empathy are in support of that idea?
It's an interesting issue. Not the 1984 part. I actually think, and I'll say something uncontroversial in response to such a good question, that there are all sorts of issues in the world that are real problems, and some of them are problems having to do with our psychologies. I think if everybody listened to my empathy book, or better still bought it, that it would have some social change. But I think the social change it'll lead to some better decision making. I think we would think differently about things like vaccines and healthcare, certainly the criminal justice system. But it's a bunch of little things. I'll give an example of a little thing, which is this differs state by state. But in some cases, there's something called victim statements, where the victims of a crime get to talk about how they've been victimized, and that plays a role in sentencing. I think this is a terrible idea. I understand its pluses. I understand victims want to do it, and that is a plus. But it leads to horrible cases of injustice. For instance, we know that the skin color of the victims plays a huge role in how empathic and how much you'll be moved by that. So if you're more cynical about empathy, you say, no, that's too prejudicial, in a very literal sense. And by getting rid of these victim impact statements, you make the world a better place, but in a small way. So my goals are more modest. Yeah.
So we use the word empathy to mean a lot of different things,
Yeah.
as you know. And in your talk, you use the word to mean a bunch of different things. And some of these things you are in favor of, and some of them you're not in
Yeah.
favor of. And I think that one of the forms of empathy you're in favor of is what we talk about sometimes as compassion. And I'm wondering why you favor compassion, because it seems that even the compassion has features in common with some of these forms of empathy that you don't. So, for example, it seems that compassion is also prone to bias.
Yep.
It also tends to be focused on individuals. It's difficult for us, I think, to feel compassion for
Yep.
groups of people. I'm not sure why that is, but I personally find that difficult to do. So I wonder why you come down positively on one form of empathy and negatively on other forms. What is it about compassion, for example, that makes it a form of empathy we should all be in favor of?
That's a great point, and it's something which I've struggled with. And so you're entirely right. Compassion is also bias. It's occasionally innumerate. It could be self-serving. In fact, cold-blooded cost-benefit decision-making, although in the abstract, by definition, is free of all of that, as humans actually practice it. I know Dan Kahan was recently here talking about this. As humans actually practice it, it tends to be motivated and distorted and so on. My endorsement of compassion comes from two directions. One direction is that it's better than empathy. I think there's the work by Tanya Singer and Matthew Ricard, as well as all the laboratory studies saying that empathy is sort of powerfully distorting. Maybe because you have to zoom in on a single person. Maybe because it's so resemblance-based. And it suffers from far more bias in the numeracy than compassion. So, but still, as you point out, compassion has this problem. I think you need something like that. I'm struck by the Humean argument that you need some sort of positive regard for other people, which is what I've been calling compassion.
Just to follow up a little bit. So on the psychopathy study, the 2011 study that you mentioned, so this, one of the affective factors is callousness.
Yep.
Callousness.
Callousness, lack of empathy. There's
lack of empathy.
shallow affect, others.
Right. So, I mean, callousness, I think is, I don't know exactly what scale they use, right? I mean, some of these scales, like the IRI, Interdisciplinary Reactivity Index, there's subscales, and one of the subscales picks out empathic concerns specifically. And now, if we see that we might think that callousness is something like a lack of empathic concern. I don't know exactly how they operationalize that in that particular study, but if that's right, then, and it's also right that there's no predicted value to lack of compassion, then why should we care about compassion? Why is compassion so important? If that's not the issue with psychopaths, they don't have compassion, but who cares? That's not what's driving their naughty behavior.
I mean,
Evil.
it's a fair point. I mean, one thing is all of these empathy scales, and I will say this, I'm no offense to anybody, but they're lousy. Because they include not only empathy in the sort of narrow sense I'm talking about, but often compassion, kindness, social adroitness, in some of the Simon Baron-Cohen scales, and so on. And so, in collaboration with two graduate students at Yale, we've created a really good empathy scale that just focuses on the sort of Adam Smith empathy, and we're trying to look at what that does and doesn't predict. Your claim, so to zoom in on your claim, you're wondering whether, well, maybe psychopaths are low compassion too. I guess my claim would be almost a conceptual one, which is, in order for somebody to be a good person, they have to have some fellow feeling. It's not enough, if they lack fellow feeling altogether, some caring for others. I think you might be right that it might not be dose dependent. That is, it may not be the more compassionate, the better person you are. But if you entirely lacked it, I just don't see that you'd be a good person. Yeah?
So Bill, before the talk, I was totally for empathy, and now I'm questioning the whole basic concept. And so
I'll settle for that.
in this talk, I'd like to ask about, A, how unified you think it is versus in person, at a distance versus the physical. I find myself to be a low empathetic person, but I can't stand giving a kid a shot or taking a dog at him even. As one idea. And then the other idea I have is empathy must vary with covariance, and boy, low empathy sounds like a good white man for this.
Spell the last part out for me. I'm not, say that again.
I'm thinking about like the classical piece of Kohler and the moral reasoning. So if you think having empathy is a lower form of moral reasoning,
Yeah.
what types of people are typically thought of as having empathy or perceiving of empathy as they vary across the big covariance scale?
So there are,
Maybe the answer is none, but.
I mean, there are various stereotypes of empathy involving, so for instance, there's some gender difference in empathy, which is maybe what you're alluding to, which is women have it more than men. Yeah. And, what's true is men are far more aggressive than women and probably far meaner in some way. That's hard to find. But the empathy differences are not large, and they're kind of unreliable. All sorts of, when you factor out other things, like simple propensity for violence, it's not clear there are huge differences. I guess in some way there are two separate questions. One question is, what does it take to be a good person? And the second question is, what do people believe it takes to be a good person? And maybe what you're getting at is, I think people believe that empathy is central to being a good person. And certainly people have criticized whole groups. Oh, they don't have much empathy. Am I missing the force of your question? I might be.
Yeah, no, I think, what about the idea that empathy is a thing as opposed to there are many, it's deployed and very,
Yeah.
and it varies across different types of things, physical.
Good. So in some ways, I'm here to foster dissent and unhappiness about the concept of empathy. And I've already chopped it up 3 ways. I put aside general compassion and kindness, caring about others, put that aside. Theory of mind, ability to understand the minds of others, versus feeling what other people feel. And there's abundant evidence these two are separate. My neuroscience friends tell me they're separate in the brain, which is, wow, that's really separate. Anyway, but you're pushing deeper. Feeling what other people feel may, in fact, break up into separable traits. I'd have the same complaint about both of them, but here's one way I think that they could be split up. People talk about emotional contagion, which is one aspect of this, which is you see your kid get a shot and you flinch. I see somebody hitting it, or I'm sad, and then you get sad. Versus imaginative empathy. Like, I imagine what it's like to be a political prisoner. And oh, that's horrible. I try to feel it. And it could be that those propensities are different. They're actually surprising, despite the fact that people have been interested in this forever. There's not only not much research on those questions, there's very little sort of individual difference measures that pull these things apart properly. What we know, based on the study I'm doing with 2 graduate students, is that your behavioral contagion. So if I sort of, if I'm itchy, you'll get itchy, or if I shiver, you'll shiver. Those are horrible examples. Here's good examples, because none of them are true. But anyway, find a good example. Tends to be strongly correlated with feeling other people's pain and not wanting to see other people hit their hand with a hammer or take a shot or something. Whether those correlate with your capacity to get pleasure from fictional experiences is a good question. Yes?
Issue that you brought up that not only was empathy biased and numerous, right?
Yes.
And you talked about Holloway, and then you said in the meantime there's a family going on.
Yeah.
Well, Holloway is an example of an economic impulse on the part of papers to sell papers, and the problem would have been much better if you had shown the children about this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
50 million people died in World War II, but then we read the story of Anne Frank, and then we say, this loss of human life and potential is extraordinary, and then you start to feel about what this meant. So I think that the Holloway example doesn't quite work for me, because that's just what we have in our current system, which is you go after things and sell papers, and the louder and the more obnoxious you be, the more attention you get to CNN, Fox, and everything else.
So I actually agree with almost everything you're saying. In fact, the Anne Frank example is a better example than anyone I would have used, because Anne Frank example says, you get people who care about 6 million Jews. It's a lot of Jews. What if it turned out to be 7 million, 5 million, 400,000? I don't know, who cares? It's a lot. But one girl triggers our emotional sentiments and has that effect. And that's an example of a wonderful example of the numeracy effect of empathy. Because I think it shouldn't work that way. I think that actually 1 million people is almost always more important than one person. And in the real world, we have to make policies and do things like how much money to put for a vaccine program or who to invade. 1 versus 1 million is really important. I totally agree with that. The one point of disagreement is I would invert what you say about the newspapers. So newspapers focusing people on Natalie Holloway only works because they know that's what people want. It's not like your average American cares just as much as some kid in Darfur as they do about an attractive white teenager who looks just like their daughter. And then newspapers are twisting us in a certain way. Rather, there's some editor, guy with a cigar, looks like J. Jonah Jameson, and he's saying, this Natalie Holloway story, I'll eat this up. And he's right. Yes.
I want to ask a question also about stories and public policy. As accepting the definition of the contrast between empathy and loving kindness and compassion, do you think that there are stories that can be told to inspire loving kindness and compassion, or do stories in public policy always kind of work on our empathy?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, you could definitely have stories that inspire compassion and care. The question is, can you do it without also engaging in empathic response? Can you tell a story to make people care about 40,000 people without picking out one and zooming in on it? I don't know. That's actually a really good question, and I don't know. I mean, I would also say the power of stories I agree with, but they're not necessary. A lot of people, for instance, are upset about climate change. There's no good stories there, actually. You know, a penguin here and there, but there's no good story. But you just say, like, here's your story. You know, if you don't fix it, we're all going to die. Ooh. Well, that's not triggering, but you know, and so it's not. Or what people might say is, you know, this current situation, it's unjust. And sometimes we're moved by actual arguments of that sort. Yes?
At least it would be my assumption that different cultural heritages, like differences between people, might lead us to think differently and reason differently. So, in light of that assumption, what mechanisms other than empathy can we use in order to level ourselves off with different types of people all around?
So, it's a really good question. The literary scholar Elaine Scarry asked this question. It says, you know, how do we engage in other people? She says, one of the big projects of literature and political persuasion has always been, make these other people as important as we are. Like, if I want to engage in your plight, I think of myself or my son, and I try to make your life as salient as my own life or my son. And Scarry says, this universally fails. We can't do that. We never do that. We try and we fail. So she suggests adopting another strategy, which she says is the philosophical one, and associates it with the political philosopher John Rawls, but also the utilitarians and so on, which is, don't make other people more significant, make yourself less significant. So to say, well, let's imagine a political system. I see people in a faraway land. I'm not going to try to feel what they feel, but I'm going to say, why don't we treat myself and them on a par? So we'll calculate the numbers, or some universal principle, and you move to sort of a less emotional, less airy level. So when faced with the injustice of an individual, I don't try to take that individual and make me feel towards the individual as I feel towards somebody I love. Rather, I just say, well, okay, well, how would a just society work through which my situation isn't so special? So it sounds like it's the world's worst title of a book, worse than this, which is make other people matter less and make yourself matter less too. Yeah.
You brought up the example of the young kid and whether you save him or not. And going off that, how would you say raw empathy, as opposed to just what we're taught to be right or wrong, influences our benevolent actions or actions done?
I think in reality, so raw empathy isn't necessary. The child example shows that. I mean, I'm sure all of us do things from day to day. You know, someone has their hands full and they're struggling for a door. And we don't say, what must it be like to have one's hands full? Oh, it's horrible. You open the door. There's somebody, you know, and not even unconsciously, because often we just know what the right thing to do. We say, we might even say, it's a really just world that people hold a door open for one another. If you have your hands full, it works out better this way. Raw empathy can sometimes be a catalyst for moral action, but I think often it leads us astray. I think it's raw empathy that leads us to give to a child beggar, even if we know that this makes the world worse in the long run. And I think to do the right thing, often we have to staunch our empathy. Yes?
I think you said that instead of education, we should more focus on reason and look at politics maybe as not just one story, but how our politics things like, oh, well, we empathize with this individual
or maybe saying, oh, well, the richer people in the world don't deserve tax breaks because they work hard for their money versus the overwhelming majority of people who can't afford to feed their family. How do we insert, rationality into that without, using empathy? Because I think both sides want to argue that they're both empathetic, but how do we, without empathy, kind of decide where we stand on this issue?
I think that's a great question, which is sort of how should political and moral discourse take place? And I think it's stuff we do naturally all the time. We make arguments. So we say, look, the kind of world we live in would be, one in which the wealth is more evenly distributed. And then another person says, why? People work hard for their money. Why should anybody else take them away? They have a right to it. And they say, well, but they use a public facility. And then you have arguments back and forth. And I think in order for these arguments to be moral arguments at all, you have to care about people. If you said, who cares? Everyone could die. We're not going to have a good discussion. And if I say, oh, if we did this, 5 children would die, and you say, we need to care. But once we had that shared ground to some minimal degree, then we make arguments. And in fact, a lot of political arguments at their best aren't even so much arguments over what ends to achieve, but really how best to achieve them. Now, not all of them. Like there's a tremendous tension between people who want a more equal society, more equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. And there's real tensions there. And then people argue. You get philosophers who come in and explain it all to us. So I'm all in favor of sort of rational, deliberative argument. And I think actually, social psychologists, you know who you are, and often make a career of saying we're no good at it. But in the real world, we often are very good at it. So I think the paradigmatic case of it isn't like a presidential election, where it's an enormous amount of signaling and posturing and like that, but rather a town hall meeting or a local meeting. So you see people meeting like in my town of New Haven, and they're arguing about where to put a stop sign. And there you get arguments over like efficiency and timing, and this is the best place, and you get people arguing in a sensible, rational way that you don't get when a bunch of people are arguing over whether you should bomb some country that half the participants have no idea where it is on the globe. Let me just make sure I want to get some other people first. Yeah.
I was wondering how development fits into this and how much blame like preschool teachers should take on for always telling kids to take the perspective of others.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's really codified in our educational system. Whenever there's two problems between kids, we sit them down and we say, consider from their perspective. It's almost like we're training them to rely on empathy instead of reason.
Yes, there's a huge business of focusing on empathy interventions and teaching kids empathy. The empathy industrial complex, I call it, a term which will never catch on. I think, so people like Marty Hoffman argue that that's actually really important. And they argue that it encourages habits of thoughts which are really important. And you can see how the argument goes. If I say, if you hit somebody and say, how would you feel if somebody did that to you? That could inspire sort of a consciousness of what you did bad and a desire to repair and so on. And I think to some extent you could imagine that in a short term doing good. There are worse things than feeling empathy for another person. It could lead to short-term reparations. I think trying to inculcate it as a moral habit is actually a bad thing. And again, there's part of an issue of sort of conceptual clarity here, because a lot of what goes on in so-called empathy training is teaching people to be nice to each other, and not empathy, all about kindness. And I'm all for kindness. But yeah, I think to some extent there's sort of, and this goes back to the question the man was asking before, which is there's the reality of what motivates our moral action and moral thought, and then there's sort of our stereotypes of morality. And the stereotypes of morality, empathy is critically important. And these I'll give you one last, I'll give maybe more, but one last anti-empathy argument. People complain bitterly, and there's been articles written about this, that in the last 20 years, on empathy scales, our empathy of college students has been going down and down and down and down. And if you look at it, it's a not a huge drop, but each year the empathy of college students drops over the last 20 years. Those last 20 years in the U.S. colleges happen to correspond in the United States with the biggest drop of violent crime that we have ever seen, correspondingly with a far more acceptance and kindness towards minorities, especially sexual minorities. Now, I'm not saying that it's because of the drop in empathy we're becoming nicer people. Even I wouldn't say that. But I do think that the stereotype of empathy being related to goodness it doesn't survive confrontation with evidence. And I think elementary school teachers are to blame. No. Yes?
You talk about everything being bad as right moral action. I'm wondering what you think about why you're so opposed to it. In particular, I know you've written a lot about adaptation and evolution, but how do you think about it in sort of a longer time? Why do we have this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we have it because empathy is actually a fairly good way of dealing with our kin, and particularly mothers and children. So people like Batson have argued pretty convincingly that the neural and hormonal systems related to empathy in adults tend to be very related to things like breastfeeding and childbirth, oxytocin and other sort of neural systems. So it could be that empathy started off as a way to connect ourselves with our kids. As you know, evolution doesn't care about, a good society and justice and so on, but that's one evolutionary theory. I'm not sure if that's true. I mean, a separate evolutionary theory says that empathy evolved as sort of a tricky mechanism to get into other people's heads. And so almost as an accident, you end up feeling what they feel, but what you're really after is the cognitive part. Yeah. Thank you.